Two major stories unfolded in late March that made national headlines, both a reckoning from a dark past whose victims have only now received some retribution. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar jury award against once beloved comedian Bill Cosby. The other, a revelation of abuse at the hands of immigrant farm worker advocate Cesar Chavez. We want to welcome JoDee Neil, attorney, advocate, and author of Outcry Witness. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
All right, so let's start with Bill Cosby if we could. So it's been about 12 years that he's been facing numerous victims claiming that he drugged and raped them in the past, and only now, at the age of 88 years old, he has been slapped with a jury award of $60 million in damages. So what does this say about the shift of victims feeling like they finally have a voice?
The Bill Cosby case is heartening because this is one instance where he doesn't get to beat the statute of limitations. Previously, this has been a really hard fact pattern to observe from the outside because he has been protected by laws that were written a long time ago, gradually expanded, but ultimately are inappropriate for cases like this because they protect perpetrators and reward their manipulative capabilities to ensure silence.
Yeah, indeed.
So I think it's encouraging for survivors that someone finally landed a punch on this guy.
Yeah, and also to add, you know, the fact that he's 88 years old, a lot of his victims aren't that much younger than he is. So I can only imagine the feeling of being heard finally after all these years has to be truly impactful.
You know, Gloria Allred did such a beautiful job giving them a platform. You know, her conference table, if you can't have a courtroom, a proper courtroom with a real jury, that's about the next best place to be.
Well, if we could move on to Cesar Chavez. So a New York Times investigation detailed multiple allegations that the late labor leader sexually abused women and girls during his time leading the United Farm Workers. And one of his victims included co-founder Dolores Huerta, who claims that his assaults resulted in pregnancies that she kept a secret days later. She's now 95 years old. Does this look like a benchmark moment for victims to feel more empowered to come forward?
Absolutely. Her disclosure is seismic in how a survivor will prioritize actually everyone else before their own needs. You know, the narrative in what I call perpetrator propaganda is they're making this up because they want money, fame, power. But Dolores Huerta is 96, and she spoke the truth finally after decades and decades and decades of personal sacrifice on a level I can't even begin to identify with. So her courage is seismic. And I think the takeaway here is that life is too short to be holding secrets for perpetrators.
I want to now kind of dive into Jeffrey Epstein because this is a really big deal, and it seems like more and more stories keep coming out. What can you share with us as far as how things are developing and also the really important names that are tied to that case?
The Jeffrey Epstein situation where we are right now appears to be a deliberate refusal to investigate the files for even the beginning of an investigation. I call the public's attention to the burden of proof, reasonable suspicion. That's like not using your blinker and getting pulled over and then they find a bunch of drugs, right? Reasonable suspicion is the lowest burden of proof in our criminal system, and I would argue plenty of it is present in the Epstein files right now. And with that reasonable suspicion, a grand jury could convene and use grand jury subpoenas, grand jury testimony, and it would all be secret. And then we could really get some traction on who's around right now who still remains a threat to children. And that should always be our primary focus. Who does this perpetrator still have access to? And the investigation should absolutely be pursued because it's sending a very clear message to Americans at all levels that the government just doesn't care.
And I want to get into grand juries. We'll do that after the break, but if I could just ask you before we do go to commercial here, what are the questions that are not being asked in the Epstein case?
Are there any other survivors
Yeah.
who would like to come forward? Has anyone negotiated a settlement and has an NDA? Because NDAs are quickly becoming illegal. I turn your attention to Elizabeth Phillips and her work with Trey's Law across the country in many states. NDAs are not okay for survivors of sexual abuse. So I would first want to create an environment where survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and his massive global criminal conspiracy might be able to come forward and actually maybe talk to someone like you or me about what happened to them.
And you say not enough to convict is not the same as not enough to investigate.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're going to take a break here, but when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about the grand jury, how those work, and also your book. We're going to do that in 2 minutes, so please don't go anywhere. Welcome back. We've been talking with JoDee Neil, attorney and author. We've been discussing these high-profile cases involving typically men who have been brought to justice in some cases, not in every case, over the abuse of women and how women are now regaining their voice. We left our last segment talking about grand jury investigations. Now, you may not be able to charge someone, but you can always investigate with enough information. So what is reasonable suspicion? What is that in the case of a grand jury?
Reasonable suspicion is really the bare minimum that it takes for police, for law enforcement in the criminal context to begin to look at a target. We know from the Epstein files, all 3.5 million pages of them, that there are many, many targets. We have access to redacted information. However, the government actually has the full copies of this information. And I don't understand why reasonable suspicion isn't something that's being talked about right now, because there's loads of it in there from what I can see.
Right, exactly. And so they're able to seize information. It will get you a grand jury. And then the grand jury does what? They compel testimony?
It could, correct. Yeah, so the grand jury, assuming someone had the authority, right? A grand jury could subpoena documents, okay? Cell phone records, plane records. I mean, the criminal system has the best subpoena power in the entire justice system, especially at the federal level.
Right.
Whatever they want, they're going to get it. They're going to get it fast and unredacted. Then they have the opportunity to compel witnesses. Members of the grand jury are regular people, just like you and me. And it is so important because then they can ask for more stuff if they want it. If they want additional records, they simply tell the prosecutor, go get them, and they do it. So it's such an effective tool for these white-collar, meaty investigations.
So where do we stand here? I mean, is there, if evidence gets you probable cause and then you get arrests, but it sounds like the DOJ stopped before step one and justified it with a step 3 standard.
That's exactly right. Pamela Bondi's replacement has actually said they're not going to do anything. So these files are out there. It's not even all of them. And they have not said whether a grand jury will be impaneled, what they're going to be looking at, who are their targets. Great Britain, Norway, France, all these countries where individuals were named in the files, there have been office raids, arrests. The monarchy in Norway is in deep trouble right now. But here in the USA, all I hear are crickets.
Right.
Not even.
And you say that one strategy is simply avoiding arrest. And so you keep your record clean. So how does one avoid arrest in these cases?
We see this all the time, especially in school perpetrator cases, where a child will make an outcry that something has happened to them at a school, and then the district gives the perpetrator the opportunity to resign. And then the perpetrator goes to another school district, and there's no background hit, a background check hit. And the system that contains the criminal history information is very closed and is typically only accessible to law enforcement, except for some exceptions for background check type, verified vendors, right? And so a person will have a background check done on them, and then there will be sort of a sweep. And if no one's been arrested, then there's nothing that's going to pop up on a sweep, much less a law enforcement search on that person. So avoiding the fingerprint and the NCIC
Yeah.
is key to flying under the radar as a perp.
It's terrible. Something needs to be changed with the justice system for sure. So as a former prosecutor and advocate focused on trauma, tell us more about your book, if you could.
Thank you. My book is the first of its kind. There was no book like it that took survivors, someone who has survived a crime upon their body, they become frozen, really paralyzed and unable to say the truth about what's happened to them. I'm constantly asked why the Epstein survivors waited so long to tell. And one, they didn't. Two, they're frozen.
Yeah.
Silence is not always a choice. A lot of times it's a response. And that's what it was for me. And finally got to the breaking point and took baby steps to say the truth about what happened to me. And these were all modeled after what I saw children do during my work as a crimes against children prosecutor. And put it all together, packaged it up into this book, which is a step-by-step guide to healing and justice after sexual violence.
Wow. Outcry Witness, and you can find it wherever fine books are sold. JoDee, thank you so much for stepping up and being an advocate for those who feel like they don't have a voice, and for championing this cause. I think we haven't heard or seen the end of this, so we would love to have you come back and further discuss this. I think it's more pervasive than we all realize.
I would be honored, and I commend you for your thoughtful consideration.
Thank you so
It means a
much.
lot to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, JoDee. We'll be back.
Take care.
After this.